listening to WTMFI 67.42 FM Chicago.
This is my Star Wars Facts of the Week review. So I go through all the facts of Star Wars that I did during the week. So let me get started with this. First off, a little recap on myself. I am a diehard Star Wars fan. I've been a fan of Star Wars since I was born. I was born in 1975. Star Wars came out in 1976. My parents took me to see Star Wars in the theater while I was still in diapers. I basically grew up because once it came out on video, my parents had it at home. When Empire Strikes Back came out, they didn't take me to see it, but I was watching that pretty much almost every other day along with Star Wars. I was hooked on Star Wars since then. I started getting my first toys when Star Wars came out. I don't think I ever had a Boba Fett, but I know I had a whole bunch of other figures and stuff like that. So I've been a Star Wars fan for as far back as I can remember. My first toys were obviously Hot Wheels and all the others, but next to those were Star Wars figures. I had one of the original X-Wings. I believe I had a Cloud City Cloud Car, and I had a bunch of other ones like little figures and stuff like that. So I had a whole collection that I had. So I have been a fan for a good long time, and Star Wars has always been a part of my life. So to the suggestion of a great friend, I decided to start going through. JP, welcome in. TD, welcome in. I decided to start doing Star Wars Facts of the Week. I post one up every day during the week, except Saturday, and then on Sunday I do a review, basically going over everything of the facts. Just a little touch on all of my facts. I do research my facts. They're not just something I pull off of my head. I research through Wikipedia.com as well as StarWars.com and make sure. Give it in. All right, Jin, welcome in. So I go through all of my facts and I make sure that they're all up to date, they're all real, and they're all accepted as canon. But I also include facts that are also from Legends, because Legends technically was canon at one time. They got decanonized, but people still reference it as because a lot of fans still love Legends. They still really enjoy it. And to touch on that, I literally went to I had to take my wife to a special lens location for her contacts, and my kid and I, we ended up walking into Barnes & Noble's. One of the first levels I went to was the upstairs level where they have all the science fiction, manga, and all that kind of stuff. And the row I went to, because I wanted to double check it, was the Star Wars section, where they literally still have Legends books available. So even one of the few bookstores that's of the big chain bookstores that were available, Star Wars books are still available. You could still pick up Legends in the stores, and I highly recommend, if you are a diehard fan and you love Star Wars, then you definitely should be reading Legends, because as much as it's decanonized, there is so much of the current canon that is related to the Legends material. So as much as people say that Legends isn't technically canon anymore, that is absolutely true. It is not canon, but there is so much of the current canon that was taken from Legends. So you can't have the current canon without referencing back to the original Legends that came out beforehand, before the acquisition of Star Wars from George Lucas to Disney. Because a lot of Legends came from material that was developed by novelists and creators that wanted to be part of Star Wars, but they couldn't be part of Lucasfilm or LucasArts in itself. So they did the only thing they could do. They wrote their fan stories and stuff like that, got them published, and there was a long time that LucasArts did acknowledge a lot of them. They didn't technically call them canon, but Legends was always part of the Star Wars genre, especially with Star Wars fans. Fans ate up Legends. They went through the comic books, the novels, the fan-made TV shows. I don't know anybody out there who still know it, but I was one of the first ones who caught the Star Wars Troops when it started up on YouTube, and man, that was a hysterical fan-made film. And it was never acknowledged by LucasArts or anything like that, but it was great. Rowan, welcome in. Brandon, welcome in. Walter, welcome in. Hi. For Marie, welcome in. B, welcome in. Thank everybody so much for coming in. This is my Star Wars Facts of the Week review. I'm going to be going through all the different facts. I've got a little presentation here I'm going to be walking through and going through all the stuff, so bear with me. If I do not acknowledge you for coming in, please don't be offended. It's because I've got a lot of material to cover here, but I really appreciate everybody that's coming on. So let's get started. Let's go through the facts of the day for this week. So the first fact, Star Wars fact of the day. This was the one that was out on Monday. The Black Sun Crime Syndicate was an organization that came into prominence during the Clone Wars as the Jedi Order focused more on military affairs. It was first introduced to fans in Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. During the Clone Wars, we are introduced to the Black Sun crime syndicate when Darth Maul has returned from the dead and is looking to expand his power base. The Black Sun was at that time run by the species called the Feline, who submitted to Maul's leadership after some short negotiations. Originally in the EU Legends, we are introduced to Black Sun during the time of the Empire in the novel Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. It was run by the Feline and led by Prince Zixor, who at the time was an ally of Emperor Palpatine and a rival to Darth Vader. In an attempt to undermine Vader, Prince Zixor put a hit on Luke Skywalker. Now, just for reference, for those of you who have not experienced my Star Wars Facts of the Day, I do have a playlist of the Facts of the Day. I've been trying to share it out as much as I can. Unfortunately, my account hasn't reached enough that I can have it linked to my profile. But if you message me about it, I can definitely send that to you. I update the playlist every week. Once I get to Saturday, I add all the facts onto that playlist so everybody can go through. When you see the facts on my profile, you have to go into the more option at the bottom for the additional details that I do add, because I don't just have the one little fact up on screen like you see here. I also include background information both from canon and legends to make sure my information is all factual. And all of this comes from Wikipedia.com as well as StarWars.com and my own experiences. So I'm not just putting this stuff out there just to say that I know more than everybody else. And none of this is meant to come in any way to say that, you know, my stuff is better than anybody else or that I know more than everybody else. Darling Nikki, thank you so much for the heart me. I appreciate that so much. Sorry, I needed to take a drink. So, back to the fact. The Black Sun Crime Syndicate is still in effect in Star Wars. Those of you who are fans of Clone Wars series, when Maul returned, we did have multiple encounters with the Black Sun Crime Syndicate. They are technically rivals as well as occasional business partners with the Pikes and the Hutts. So the Hutt crime family and all that is still a common thing in Star Wars lore. There's a ton of books and comic books that have actually chronicled the Black Sun. Prince Zixor was a character for a long period of time in Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. I'm not going to ruin the ending, but he was the primary bad guy that was in it. The Emperor and Vader were featured, but they weren't technically in the actual combat. But this was also the introduction of so many different characters in that particular group. Prince Zixor actually had an assassin droid that actually looked like a human being. It was the first time we really had a really in-depth cybernetic aspect. So kind of the cybernetic upgrades and stuff like that. You saw that a lot. Oh, thank you. Darling Nikki, thank you so much. You saw this in, if you got a chance to watch Book of Boba Fett, you saw the guys that did the alterations, like the Minwa's character, Felix. She actually had the material done on her to save her from assassination. So a lot of that is still in play, but a lot of it, again, had its origins in Legends. So cool little thing. I unfortunately don't remember the assassin's name. If you want to know more, let me know in comments. I will see if I can look it up for you later and definitely respond back to you. So I decided this week I was going to cover a lot of the crime aspects because that was something that George Lucas went into in the original Star Wars trilogy, was to include the underworld. That was the reason why we had the bounty hunters, why we had the criminals at the cantina, why we had the encounter with Jabba the Hutt in Return of the Jedi. That was the whole thing with Star Wars, is that George Lucas not only wanted to show the political aspects of both the Empire and the Rebellion, but he also wanted to include the underworld, the real dark underworld that existed in the galaxy, because that's something that we have just in modern day. There's not just, the good and the bad. There's also the gray, the underlying, that can work for both the good and the bad. Because as much as people, don't like bounty hunters or don't like criminals and stuff like that, there are a lot of things that are available through that kind of thing that you get with the criminal underworld, because there's criminal elements in so many different things, both in politics and in just everyday life. I mean, you have the police, you have criminals. It's pretty much a touch and go with both, and it's all included in Star Wars, which is one of the reasons why it's as popular as it is because it includes so many aspects of real life. Okay, and that was the reason why I wanted to clue in on this were my facts this week. And I will go into other crime organizations eventually. I've only been doing this for about a month, so I've got a lot of material that I'm eventually going to get to. All right, so moving on to the next fact. Star Wars facts of the day. The Pikes Syndicate is a dealer in the spice cartel. The syndicate is run by the Pikes family that makes its homeworld on planet Obadiah. The Pikes gained power in the spice cartel during the Clone Wars. The Pikes became the galaxy's preeminent spice dealers, gaining control of mining operations on Kessel and funneling illicit substances to Coruscant's most influential crime families. Since that time, the Pike Syndicate has expanded their influence by allying their forces with Darth Maul's Shadow Collective and Crimson Dawn. They have waged multiple territory disputes with the Hutt's crime family, but do regular sales with them through smugglers. The Pike's primary dealings with the spice delivery is by employing smugglers who are willing to navigate the dangerous Kessel Run flight course near the mines of Kessel, which they oversee with great hostility. Now, a lot of you probably have encountered a lot of this, depending upon what you are a fan of through Star Wars. Some people who really love the Han Solo movie, the Pikes were actually featured in that as the ones who were running Kessel. Now, you also ran into them in the Book of Boba Fett. We saw them as the primary offenders and instigators of what was happening on Tatooine with Boba Fett when he was trying to take control. Like the Pikes family was kind of trying to move in just after the Hutts tried to move in. And we really saw that aspect in there. You also saw the Pikes in the Clone Wars animated series. They were major players with Darth Maul when he made his return. They were also featured in some of the other events that happened in Clone Wars, both in slave trade as well as smugglers and bounty hunters, all of which were included in multiple episodes. I unfortunately don't have all the episodes listed, but you could look up this information through Wikipedia. They go through a lot more detail on the Pikes and what they were involved in. But I really like that one of the places we ended up running into the Pikes again was in the Bad Batch. So I really love the Bad Batch series, and I know a lot of people really loved it. There was a whole lot that was involved with the Bad Batch, Clone Wars, and so much that involved the Pikes. I'm a little disappointed we didn't get any of that in some of the sequel movies, but honestly, I'm expecting a lot more when they finally do decide to expand that end of the universe, but we don't need to get into that. I know, Abby, I loved it too, absolutely. And that's the reason why I wanted to cover the Pikes, because as much as people aren't really into the underworld, they were major factors in so many lores are based around Star Wars, the Clone Wars, and everything that happened in there. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to include them. Okay, moving on to the next fact of the week. Star Wars fact of the day. This was the one that came out on Wednesday. Spice is a drug and narcotic in the Star Wars galaxy. Frequently traded by criminal organizations like the Pike Syndicate, it's primarily mined by slave labor on hazardous planet Kessel. Spice, which is a catch-all term primarily mined on Kessel, other sources do exist, both natural and artificial substances. Spice has many forms of varieties ranging from medicinal raw spice to highly potent and addictive illicit recreational narcotics. Notable varieties include glitterstem, most powerful and rare, Rill, used for both medicine and recreation, Susan, and Polystine. The Star Wars galaxy views the addictive form of spice to be highly illegal, and the Galactic Republic have made many public efforts to curb its trade through many corrupt members though many corrupt members made allowances for underworld trade and favors. Now, this is brought up, actually, I think it was brought up a couple times in Andor. I don't know exactly which episodes, but I know they make reference to it, and there are some scenes that actually make reference to the spice and the trade. It's funny that the glitterstem and Rill that I mentioned, those were used predominantly in the Legends books for going into detail, because a lot of the books and stuff that we got during the time period before the new sequel movies and stuff like that, and before the Clone Wars, a lot of that was included in the books and novels. So, and before the prequels came out, that was pretty much where we got all of our information from, because of course Lucasfilm wasn't giving out much, but Spice was a major player in a lot of what was going on. And we find out that was what Han Solo was originally shipping with him when he was working with Jabba the Hutt. And there's a whole aspect about that that's covered, I believe it was covered in the Star Wars adventure novel, and they go into a lot more detail about that. And it's really interesting stuff about how Spice has brought the underworld into being. I mean, there was so much more going on. I mean, we find out about the slave trade in the prequels, because that's what Anakin and his mother are. We find out about bounty hunters and stuff like that, because they're the ones who are actually hunting down Padme and trying to assassinate her in Attack of the Clones. There's so many different aspects where, you know, the underworld is brought in, and the Spice is one of the primary connections between all of that, because you can't have any kind of, you know, criminal activity without some kind of drug source. And I'm not exactly sure, but I believe some of the things that are actually brought up in the scene, if I remember right, from the Cantina Bar in the original Star Wars, you actually do see some of the people, you know, having discussions, stuff like that. Rumor mill had it that some of them were actually talking about like spice trade and stuff like that, and negotiations and stuff like that. That's the reason why so many were gathered around tables. Now, I don't know if any liquids or anything like that being used, but I know that there were some references to that. If you go through some of the facts and lore, George Lucas didn't mention it in some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, that it was in the background, and you definitely get a view of this in the prequels. Because there's the scene with death sticks, though technically that's not spice per se. It is one of the drugs that is spread throughout the galaxy and is actually used. So there are a lot of touches of spice and drugs and that kind of thing in the Star Wars universe. It's usually an underlying just to use as a plot point, but it is there. And it's something that I always found interesting that George Lucas included it, because it really goes into the depth of Star Wars and what motivates so many people in that universe. Because you have those who are motivated by profit, motivated by control, motivated by truth, motivated by religion. There's so many different aspects that are brought into Star Wars from all those different, you know, realms, and you really get the understanding of what is going on with the characters when you see where their motivation is of survival. Like Han Solo, he's a smuggler, he's a scoundrel, but he's interested in profit. Whereas Luke, he's interested in truth, following through, rebelling against the Empire. But his values are more of a moral aspect of securing a positive political standing. Whereas Princess Leia, she's in the same boat similar to Luke, but hers is more political, not for power, but more for benefits for all the people. Whereas the Empire is more interested not only in power, but also money. Whereas you have the gangsters, who are more interested in financial control as well as controlling certain aspects of those finances. So you get all the different layers that have to do with what's going on in the universe, which you can apply to everyday life. There's so many different aspects that you could look into just in the current state of the United States itself, which relates to what is going on in Star Wars. So I really thought this was some interesting stuff, which is the reason why I brought these facts up, because there's so much that can relate to what's currently going on in our world right now that relates directly to Star Wars. Granted, Star Wars is fiction, but because there is so much that's related to Star Wars that relates to what's happening right now, you can't deny that it's so cool that we've had this for so long, and so many of these aspects we see because so many fans were a fan of Star Wars, and they actually see what's going on right now based on their experiences with it. And I love that aspect about it. Okay, let's move on to the next fact. Let me just roll my sheet up here. Okay. Star Wars fact of the day. This is the one I posted up on Thursday. The Hutt Syndicate is based on the planet Nal Hutta and is the headquarters of the Grand Hutt Council. The Hutt clan, based in Hutt space, holds a reputation as a haven for smugglers and other denizens of the galaxy. The Hutt clan was one of the most powerful crime families in the galaxy. a committee of elder Hutts that would advise on strategy and make decisions on interfamily disputes, making riches through smuggling, and a myriad of illegal businesses across worlds. As a Hutt Council member and later sole leader of the cartel, crime lord Jabba de Zilik Churit, aka Jabba the Hutt, exerted great influence over the entire Hutt enterprise, despite, in theory, only representing his own crime family, the Zarturi clan. Jabba's power truly was so great that Count Dooku and Jabba's uncle Zero considered him the leader of every Hutt clan. Even then, Jabba would need the council's approval for certain high important operations. While he would attend council meetings via hologram, which we actually see in Star Wars Clone Wars, Jabba remains centered on the planet Tatooine within his personal palace. From Tatooine, Jabba held influence over businesses in the entirety of the Outer Rim territories. So this is one of the things that everybody should knows about, because Jabba was the first real gangster that we were introduced to in the Star Wars trilogy. Because the whole thing is that he wanted Han Solo. He had put a bounty out on Han Solo all over the galaxy based on the events that took place during Star Wars A New Hope. So you had that underlying story that we had in A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and finally coming to fruition in Return of the Jedi, which I always thought was really cool that they put that little underlining story into Han Solo. So it gives a little bit more background, which made you realize that he, as much as he was a cool guy, you got that he had, all this negative aspects about his life. Even though he did support the rebellion, you obviously got that he couldn't give that 24/7 because he had a bounty on his head. And they actually make reference to his bounty in Empire Strikes Back, that they ran into some bounty hunters on Ord Mantell. And there's an actual couple scenes that were done. They've been done both in the Star Wars comics that are done by Marvel, but originally they actually harkened back to this in a couple Star Wars novels that were done originally. And I think even under the Marvel line, they did reference it. I don't have all the details on the issues and stuff like that, but you could definitely look this stuff up on Wikipedia and StarWars.com. I believe StarWars.com has started posting up stuff like that. The problem is that because so much material is put out in novels and Marvel comics, that technically not all of it is canon, but you can still read about the stuff. And eventually, if they decide to make it canon, then you will eventually, you'll see it up on screen, or it'll be referenced in a TV show or movie or something like that. So I've always had a well-rounded view of seeing everything, reading as much as I can, and trying to find out as much as I can, which always I find really interesting, is to look stuff up, find out what's actually going on, but actually to learn, what people like and what people don't like. Because you get multiple different versions of the kinds of things, and so you get to make up your own mind. There's so many versions of, Star Wars from the novels that were done in Legends, plus the stuff that's currently being put out by Marvel Comics, and the current novels that are being done. So you get a lot of material that you can reference and you can read about. Whether or not it'll be canon or not is out of our control, but we still get to enjoy it. And that's one of the things that I really love about Star Wars, is there is so much to have access to. You're not limited by, stuff that's been out. If you only watch the movies and the TV shows, yes, you will definitely be limited. But there is more than enough material that you could actually read about and get more information to learn and enjoy. So, getting back to Jabba the Hutt. So, his crime family, there are so many more Hutts that I ran into while I was doing my research. Unfortunately, I knew I wasn't going to be able to cover anything. Nikki, welcome in. There's so much great stuff that came on through the Return of the Jedi, that the Hutts pretty much became a big thing. Like during the time period of Legends, you got so much more about the Hutt Syndicate and what was actually going on with them, that you realize that the gangster level of the Hutts was extremely vast. And if you ever looked at the maps of the Star Wars universe, they actually have Hutt space near Nal Hutta is a very large area. It covers multiple planetary systems. And you know that the Hutts have ties in with both the Pike Syndicate and Black Sun. They are family rivals, just like any gangster families that are here, in modern day. There are multiple families that deal in very specific crime areas. So the Hutts were well known for smuggling. That was basically they had a plethora of bounty hunters and stuff like that, and they dealt in, I believe, slave trade as well as I'm trying to remember some of the other ones because a lot of this is brought up in the sequels, not the sequels, the prequel trilogy, because you find out about the slave labors because the Hutts pretty much control everything that's going on Tatooine. That's the reason why Jabba the Hutt was viewed at the races, the pod races, because he's pretty much the dominant force on Tatooine. Even in the early days, even during the Republic, there was only so much the Jedi could do to curb gangsters and that kind of thing. So they still had a lot of control over the majority of the galaxy. The Republic and the Jedi did do a good job on keeping things under control, but there was only so much they could cover. I mean, you got to realize how big the galaxy is. There's only so much that the Jedi and the Republic can do. I mean, we had a lot of this referenced in like the Tales of the Jedi, where we see Count Dooku, who when he was out with Qui-Gon as a Padawan, and that he was encountering a lot of details and a lot of encounters with corrupt politicians and stuff like that, which just goes to show that crime was a common thing in the Star Wars galaxy. It wasn't a perfect environment, which is something that I also really thought was interesting about Star Wars, is you do not get a picture-perfect environment. There is just as much darkness and gray area in Star Wars as there is in any modern-day thing that we live in our regular lives, which was a real aspect that was great about Star Wars, is that it didn't hold back from letting you know that things were not perfect. The movies had very specific messages. The TV shows had very specific messages. I mean, you even saw that in the Clone Wars TV series, it was not shot in order. That's something a lot of people forget about, is that the Star Wars animated series of Clone Wars was not shot in order. It was shot with a lot of independent stories that were thrust throughout the entire series. Now that it's come out now that you could actually go back and watch the entire series in the correct chronological order. But the great thing about the Clone Wars is that it allowed you to see so many different things that were happening, and that it was happening throughout the galaxy. And the crime syndicates, specifically with the Hutts, they were always a primary source. It was great when Black Sun and the Pikes were brought in as additional crime families, and you found out about more bounty hunters and the slave trade. You got to learn so much more about the galaxy and what was going on. It wasn't just a clean sweep kind of a thing. You actually found out there was so much more darkness that was going on in the galaxy. And Jabba the Hutt was just one of the primary darkness parts of that. That he was obviously, a big slug, and that his entire control was done through fear and understanding that he was a powerful crime boss, that he had people that were loyal to him, that would not just stab him in the back for nothing, that he had people by his side that were willing to do whatever he wanted in order for them to get profit, and they knew that they would get it from him. So that was the control aspect that the Hutts really had over the entire Star Wars galaxy, is that they had their hands and mitts into literally everything. And I think that's one of the coolest things that wasn't shown in Andor, was that they really just focused on the political aspect, but there was the hint that there was more going on behind the scenes in Andor that had to do with the criminal element. Because, of course, the rebels were considered criminals. They were lumped into the same categories as a lot of the crime organizations and stuff like that, even to the point where you got the idea that the Empire, was kind of looking at both the criminals and the rebels as working together, what they actually weren't. But it just goes to show that the Empire was so full of themselves that they didn't know exactly what was going on, which is why there was so much, discontent between so many of the ISB. And I love that aspect in Andor, that they really got into the aspect is not everybody knew what was going on throughout the galaxy. That even though the Empire had taken over, they still didn't know everything that was going on. But because they were so high up, they didn't really worry about it. They'd let the people worry about it. They didn't worry about it themselves. And just knowing so much was going on that transferred over from the Clone Wars series into the Rebellion, you really can't not enjoy that aspect, that underlying dark story that's going on. That as much as there's the big story between the Rebellion, the Empire taking over, the fall of the Republic, that there was still all these shady deals and stuff going on underneath. And I just can't help but enjoy that additional story that you get. That there's so much more going on, that you can invest yourself into just the Empire. You can invest yourself in the Rebellion. You can invest yourself in the bounty hunters. There's so much to enjoy and so much to get into. And I think that's one of the really great things about Star Wars is there's not just one thing there is to love. There's so much to love. You can't just hook onto one thing that's about Star Wars because there's so much. I mean, as much as I love, my favorite characters from the movies, like Luke and Wedge Antilles, and my favorite characters from the novels, Mara Jade and Dash Rendar. There's so many different aspects to them. And then, of course, who doesn't love Boba Fett? I mean, his story throughout the prequels and the original trilogy, how can you not love him? His story is so good. And there's so much more to love beyond Boba Fett, because you find out, of course, we now have Mandalorian and Grogu, Din Djarin, and his whole story, the whole story about Mandalore and how things came to be. I mean, there's so much to love, and just the whole crime aspect of the Hutts, the Pikes, the spice trade, the slave trade. There's so much more that you can get into in Star Wars than just one or two things. Okay, so let's move on to the last fact, which was one I was gearing up to read this because I wanted to definitely do this. Because last week I did the X-Wing, so I definitely want to do subject matter of this one. Star Wars fact of the day, the TIE Series Starfighter, developed by Senior Fleet Systems, developed into the Galactic Empire's primary mass-produced starfighter, deriving its name from the C-TIE twin-ion engine and its memorable flight sound. Developed by Wraith Senior of Senior Fleet Systems, from Clone Wars era technology, it became the starfighter that would become the standard of air and space dominance of the Galactic Empire. Known for high speed and maneuverability, the iconic TIE prioritized cost effectiveness over shields before evolving into advanced specialized models including bombers, interceptors, Avenger, Defender, and more advanced models for a multitude of aerial combat. The designs of the Starfighter series continued ionized reactor, solar array wings with ball-style cockpit throughout its time under the Empire and Imperial Fist. TIE Fighter was originally designed with the bare minimum a ship needs to function, being essentially nothing more than a cockpit with weapons on the front and an engine in the rear. The simplicity in design made them both quick and inexpensive to build and replace. Now, this one I really loved. I loved going into it last week. If you guys want to check out the full version of my these reviews, I have them posted up through the link on my profile. It'll take you to the page I have everything on. So definitely go and check them out. Because last week I covered the X-Wing, so I needed to do the TIE Fighter because everybody knows from the original trilogy, it was always the X-Wing versus the TIE Fighter. And there, of course, there was the Advanced TIE Fighter, and then we had the Bomber TIE Fighters, and then we had the Interceptor TIE Fighters. I mean, there's been so many variations on the TIE Fighter that we've seen from the original trilogy, the sequel trilogy, and especially in the sequel trilogy. I mean, I love all aspects of the fight between the X-Wings and the TIE Fighters because I always thought they were so cool, but I always felt so bad for the TIE Fighter pilots. And I only say this because I was a big fan of the Star Wars video games. So I played Star Wars X-Wing when it first came out. I played Star Wars TIE Fighter when it came out. And I absolutely loved Star Wars Battlefront and Battlefront 2 because they included the X-Wings, the TIE Fighters, the A-Wings, the Y-Wings into them. I mean, you got to fly all these things. You got to experience the whole aspect. But this is something that a lot of people don't realize is that they did in the Battlefront series, they did include shields on the TIE Fighters because they wanted to make sure everything was fair. But when you see the movies and stuff like that, The TIE fighters have no shields, no defense whatsoever, so you really had to have a clear understanding when you got into that TIE fighter. If you were shot down in space, you were sucking vacuum as soon as that thing blew up. If you were able to survive the destruction of your ship, you were pretty much sucking vacuum, which you really get that aspect. And this is something that's actually brought up in the Star Wars novels during Legends. Is one of my favorite book series was Star Wars Rogue Squadron and the X-Wing Race Squadron that came after that, because TIE fighters were very heavily used in the subject matter, and you had to have an understanding of what the TIE fighter pilots had to go through, because you have to remember, in a time period changeover from the Old Republic to the Empire, there was pretty much a massive changeover in vehicles, and we saw this a little bit in Bad Batch and some of the other animated series, including Clone Wars, that there was a steady development of ships that was going on, that we were moving from one into another. And you got this in some of the bombers that were used in Bad Batch, that they were using the ion engines, so you heard the same sounds and stuff like that, even though they weren't TIE fighters themselves, because the TIE fighters came much later. But the design of the TIE fighters, as I did my research, and I checked both StarWars.com and Wikipedia, so the TIE fighters specifically were designed to be cheap. That's the reason why whenever you see the TIE fighters, they're always coming in very large swarms, because they were anticipating if they did have to run into starfighter combat, the Empire would be able to overwhelm any enemies through sheer brute force, which was what the Empire's strategy with a lot of their warfare was done by, pure brute force. They sent in battalions of stormtroopers and large amounts of starfighters with the TIE fighters. So in order to put so much out, they didn't invest a lot into the starfighters themselves beyond just being able to be fast, efficient, and deadly, which was what they were. As if you look at any of like the simple, because most of the time when the Empire was taking on ships like that, they were taking on ships that were like regular, cruisers and stuff like that. Which some of them had shields, but they didn't have great defensive capabilities. So if you've got one big ship, but you have 5 to 10 TIE fighters firing at them all at once, it doesn't matter how many guns you're able to turret on that ship, unless they're really good automated or droid-based ones, those TIE fighters are going to overwhelm your shields and disable your ship. So, and that was the concept that the Empire was working with when developing the TIE fighter, overwhelming their enemies with massive amounts of fighters. And most TIE fighter pilots gained skills through those encounters. They learned what was the best way to approach, how not to approach. Because that was what was happening during the time period going from the Republic into the Empire, is that they had time and more than enough bodies to develop TIE fighter technology and train their pilots, who many of which came to the Imperial Academy and trained on some of the older ships that did have shields. But when they finally learned on the TIE fighter, they had to realize that they did not have access to shields, which meant that their skills had to be peak, which is the reason why even the TIE fighters, even though they were going up against like the X-Wing, A-Wing, Y-Wings that had not only better armor, but also shields, they were still able to take them down because, one, overwhelming force, and two, the pilots were really good at their job. That's the reason why you don't do a comparison between TIE fighter pilots and stormtroopers on their shooting, because it was extremely obvious that TIE fighter pilots knew how to hit the target. They didn't normally miss. They stayed on their targets, and they really knew how to combat them. And you saw this in the original New Hope Star Wars when they were in those combats, even though the X-Wings... Sorry, I forgot to turn off my thing. That even though the X-Wings had shields, the TIE fighters were still able to take out those X-Wings because they were able to take them down because their blasters were a little bit better. So they were able to get more, their targets were able to be hit more efficiently, break through the shields, and take out the fighters. Now, granted, when an X-Wing got behind a TIE fighter, all it needed to do was hit once. Boom! Those guys are going up. So that was the trade-off, is that yes, you had TIE fighters in abundance and they could overwhelm their targets, but all you had to have on the opposite side was a really skilled pilot who knew how to get behind a TIE fighter, get locked on, and take it out. And most of the times, they wouldn't need to use their proton torpedoes or anything like that. They could just use their laser cannons to take them out. Because that was another thing that was shown in Battlefront, that you could have, that TIE fighters had missile launchers and stuff like that. But in the original trilogy, they did not have any kind of missiles or anything on the TIE fighters. It was just guns. Excuse me, I needed to take a drink. So that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the TIE fighter itself, is that it had incredible speed, incredible maneuverability, really good cannons, and they could go toe-to-toe with an X-Wing and possibly win. That was the reason why they were so interesting. For you had the X-Wing, which had all of the benefits of decent speed, a hyperdrive, good weapon systems, and a shield system. But the TIE fighter did not have all of those things, but they were still considered a very real threat. That even though they had all that capability, and most starfighters were able to stand up to a TIE fighter, the majority of them couldn't handle them in mass. Like, for example, if you have one X-Wing versus 3 TIE fighters, there's a very good chance that X-Wing is going down. Because as great as an X-Wing is, it cannot take on so many fighters all at once. I mean, you get one coming from behind and 2 flying in from alternate routes from left and right. You are not going to be able to survive very long unless you are really skilled at outmaneuvering those fighters. So, I mean, a one-on-one X-Wing versus TIE fighter, there's a very good chance that X-Wing is going to take out that TIE fighter. And you actually saw this in Star Wars Squadrons. There's several scenes where you actually see a TIE fighter versus an X-Wing, and the X-Wing is able to do a lot more damage, even to a TIE Interceptor, even though it is way faster and has just as many weapon systems, but it's just not armored enough to take on an X-Wing. And many of the times, it wasn't, the pilot's skill that was able to save it. It was usually an additional factor, like either it was able to outmaneuver in a debris field, or it was able to get into a location where an alternate pair of guns was able to take it out. There was another aspect that you had to realize when you're an X-Wing pilot, that there is a lot more at stake with your life in a TIE fighter than it would be if you were flying around in an X-Wing or something like that. Now, they changed that around, which I thought was really cool in the sequel trilogy, where you had TIE fighters that not only had shields, but they also had proton torpedo capability, which I thought was super cool. That you finally put the TIE fighter almost on the same level as an X-Wing. That even though they had just as much firepower and just as much skill, you still had the skill of an X-Wing versus a TIE fighter pilot. So it was really a pilot-to-pilot battle, so true dogfighting, which for me personally, that was one of always my things that I absolutely loved about Star Wars, was the dogfighting aspect. Harkening back to what was, seen during World War II and World War I, where you had planes that were flying against each other in the air and all that. And that kind of strategy always I thought was super cool for me. And it was part of the reason why I got into World War II lore about dogfights and stuff like that, was specifically because Star Wars went into it between the X-Wings and the TIE fighters. And that was really one of the reasons why I wanted to really do a more in-depth view. And if you go on Wikipedia.com and StarWars.com, there is a lot of detail about the TIE fighters and all the different variants. I mean, X-Wings, A-Wings, Y-Wings, all the different ships that are used in the Rebellion are not really the same. I mean, there's a lot of variety, but the majority of them have very specific jobs. Whereas the TIE fighters, there's so many variants of TIE fighters. It's not like this is the X5 and the X6 and all that different thing. No, there was just the TIE fighters and the variants thereof. I mean, you can't say that an A-Wing and an X-Wing are the same thing. They are definitely not the same thing, and the way they're flown is not the same thing. Whereas TIE fighters, you pretty much go into the aspect of the pilot in those vehicles. They have to be skilled in order to fly those things, in order to stay alive. And that was really the aspect that I loved about that, was that you really got into that whole aspect of survival for a TIE pilot. I mean, when you're sitting in the theater and you're watching that, you have no sympathy for the TIE fighter pilots because they're the bad guys. Everybody knows they're the bad guys. And, the Rebel Alliance is the good guys. The TIE fighters are the bad guys. And you got that in Star Wars Rebels. You really got that, which, by the way, I still think that Sabine's paint job on that TIE fighter was absolutely gorgeous. And I really wish that somebody would put that out as a toy or a model or something like that, because that is just so cool. And I'm sure somebody out there has bought like a TIE fighter model and repainted it to look like that. But personally, I think that Lego needs to come out with with Sabine's TIE fighter, where you actually get to see it with all the different colors and stuff like that. Because I just think that looks so cool. And honestly, that would be a great one to have, where you have Sabine and Zeb and Ezra for that. I think that would be a great set for them to come out with. I think I might have seen it on Lego Ideas, possibly. Don't quote me on that. I just remember flicking through, and I think I saw somebody mention it. So I have to go back online and see if I can find it. But I just really think that would be a really cool Star Wars set to come out. Hey, maybe they'll come out for Star Wars Day. I don't know, because we got that coming up in less than a month. So I'm really looking forward to that. So so that is all of my facts for this week. So I really enjoyed talking about this.